Hello, my name is Lisa Burzell, and we're doing another culinary airbrush how-to. And today we're going to focus on the basics of decorative airbrushing with cocoa butter. Cocoa butter comes in a huge variety of colors and styles, from solids to pearls to lusters. It has a nice opaque coverage, so you've got a lot of creative possibilities. However, cocoa butter does have some very specific characteristics. For chocolate confectionery making, you have to have an understanding of chemistry and crystal structures and seeding and temperature and humidity. And yes, keep water away from cocoa butter. They do not like each other. But for today, we're just going to focus on the relatively straightforward things you know in order to be able to do decorative cocoa butter airbrushing. Cocoa butter comes as a solid, and it melts at 88 degrees. Get the temperature higher than that, and it will fall out of temper and it will separate. You don't want to melt the entire bottle, just enough to be able to pour off color when you need it, as you need it. The solid unmelted core will help the cocoa butter stay in temper. And what we'll do is occasionally rotate the bottom, top to bottom, to distribute those cocoa butter crystals back and forth. You can use a microwave to melt your cocoa butter, but just know that a microwave will melt from the inside out. So you have to be very patient. If you rush it, you're going to have a very hot center and a very barely melted outside. And what will result is a cocoa butter that'll fall out of temper or burn. You can bring the cocoa butter back into temper by rotating the bottom, top to bottom, but it does take a while and a lot of patience. If it's burned, it's going to have hard, crunchy carbon bits in it that affect the finish and will clog your airbrush, so just throw it out. A yogurt maker makes a nice warming tray for at your station when you're actually working on a project, although it does work best with half-full bottles. Another option is a heating pad that you can wrap around the bottles. Cocoa butter is very thick, so we need a larger tip size for the cocoa butter to go through. This is a 0.5 side feed tritium that we're going to be using today. The front end of the airbrush is all metal, so it has to be at 88 degrees or slightly above, just like the cocoa butter, or else it's going to cool off and become solid inside the airbrush. So I like using a wrapped up heating pad as a holster to keep my airbrush warm. It works really, really well. If you're very careful, you can use a hairdryer or a heat gun to heat up the tip. But again, very careful, because if you get this too hot, you're going to burn the cocoa butter on the inside of the airbrush, and then you've got carbony chunky bits that are clogging the airbrush, and you've got a real mess on your hands. Also, that fluid nozzle, even though it's steel, it's very thin and very delicate. Constant overheating of that fluid nozzle is going to shorten the lifespan of that nozzle and increase the risk of damage. So again, you have to be very careful. We're also going to be spraying at a higher PSI than we would for water-based or alcohol-based cake colors. We need to spray at about 30 psi, so have your spray booth set up and ready to go, because there's going to be a lot more overspray in the air. After that, the spray techniques are exactly the same as what we've already gone over. Gradients and stencils, everything you're already familiar with. We are going to be introducing one new technique today, and that's splatter. This is an old cake dummy we're going to be playing with. Base gradient. Light blue over the indigo. I'm airbrushing a pink pearl on top, gradient from heavy to light. The pearls are a subtle color, so let's see if the camera catches this. Object lesson of what we've been talking about earlier. We're in a hot studio in Southern California and it's almost 100 degrees outside. So even though the gradients, the two colors, blended nice and smoothly and I've got a nice base, any speckling that you see is because we're spraying with a larger paint globule because of the size of the cocoa butter. But the finish is nice and smooth and consistent. When I went to airbrush on with my stencil and my pearls, I heated up the tip of the airbrush with my hairdryer because it was cooling down a little bit too much and I overdid it. So that as the stencil is settling, you can see it's starting to puddle and move around a little bit and bead. So if I'd taken my time, I would have gotten a nice, clean, crisp stencil out of my pearls. So again, you can see this is really shiny. It's not setting up as fast as what my gradients did. So, object lesson. Do as I say, not as I do. Here you can see the two blues that were used to build the base gradient. You can see the stenciling peeking through. You can see the splatter technique from the pink. And when we built up a real heavy splatter at the round edge, and then I used just air to force all that splatter to make nice runs and drips down the side of the cake. I get asked all the time how to do splatters. It's an old technique that goes back to the 80s. Probably even earlier. All you need is a craft stick, an airbrush, and some practice. We're basically painting on the end of the stick and using the PSI of the airbrush to flick the color puddle onto the paint surface. Where you place the stick and the angle of the stick affects the pattern, so it does take some practice. Cleanup with cocoa butter is fairly easy, but honestly, the fastest and easiest thing to do is to just have an airbrush dedicated to cocoa butter use, because then you can rinse out the old color using melted plain cocoa butter. Once the color is all airbrushed through, sprayed through, let the plain cocoa butter harden in the airbrush, set the airbrush aside till the next time you're ready to use it, pull it out, stick it in your heating pad holster, and you're ready to go. If you do have to go back and forth between regular airbrush colors and cocoa butter, then yes, you're going to have to wash all the cocoa butter out of the airbrush. In that case, go ahead and use warm sudsy water. Again, the water should be warm. It doesn't need to be boiling. Just spray through, back bubble, wash the airbrush out, and just be certain that all the moisture is out of the airbrush before you go back to cocoa butter again.